Well, thank you, Patrick. Luckily, I've managed to rope in one of our S&C coaches as well, Sam Wilson. So the reason why we brought Sam in as well is to talk about how we integrate the data and how we use it for drill design alongside that as well. One of Sam's roles as part of his role with the first team, is working on field with the pitch delivery in rehab. And this works very closely with our rehab coordinator, Tim Parham. As mentioned by Patrick, I'm going to try and talk about how we utilize data and its input in drill design. And we'll touch on principles that we will talk later on an Arsenal SEMS special e-edition at the end of the month. Now, the Arsenal SEMS stuff originally was built by Gary O'Driscoll and Colin Lewin, and I think a lot of us have been affected by that with learning a lot of information from it. And we're only going to touch a little bit on what we're going to present there as well later on in the month. I'd also like to start by highlighting that Sam and myself are only part of a team of highly skilled people, and many people have had input in this process. And we've both been very lucky that we've had the opportunity to question ourselves from others' inputs as well. And this is all accumulated into the direction we've gone in. Like I said, some of it will be, some extra bits will be put on the Arsenal SEMS website later on in the month. And also, we want to say a big thank you to Alan McCall, who has also helped us, especially built in some of this stuff. Now, with most presentations like regarding technology and data, I'd like to highlight that technology is advancing, and this has been a great benefit to both the performance and medical staff throughout. It enables us to now understand what may happen or what has happened just by delving into data a little bit more and make a more informed decision process in what we're going to decide. However, what I always say is that the technology will never affect the outcome. It is and always will be the people interpreting that data. Now, all of us on here could have the same data set, but we could all interpret that information differently. And that all depends on how we look at the data itself. For that reason, it's important that we understand what the data may mean, how looking at it in different forms may alter our decision making. For this reason, I would suggest that you have an importance of looking at an overview of information and not just being focused on one area. We require to be transparent and be able to inform every person as part of our team of the information we are looking and processing of the information. By doing stuff like this, we're able to reduce our chances of missing out or misinterpreting key information that could affect our decision-making process. So like I said, technology is improving and increasing at a rapid rate. More products are becoming available, which means more data points for the sports scientist, for the S&C coach to keep an eye on. Now, given a small example of the variables that are produced by STATSports, and there are many, many others in the background that we could look at. So I'm going to reference a paper by Aikenhead and Nassis from a couple of years back, where they actually surveyed sports teams and the use of physical metrics. The outcome from that was 50 different metrics were highlighted by all the people that took part as being key to look at. Now, when we consider that each variable can be expressed in both an absolute or relative term with respect to time or total distance. So for example, if you looked at dynamic stress load divided by distance or high speed running per minute, and there's many more of these, the potential number of available variables and thus the complexity increases dramatically. From that study, it's also suggested that most teams will look at 7 key variables within their teams. But I just want to point out that the idea of 50 variables being highlighted by different staff members, that shows that there is a big risk for us as practitioners to get lost in the noise. And that's where it's key that we're able to find the signal that's required for our team and how that can affect our industry and what we need to look at in order to deliver the club's philosophy on how we work. So there's a variety of ways of measuring information. So if we go for a real basic overview, you've got the volume, so this is the total. So in a session, we can do 5 kilometers in a session. The intensity of that is the total divided by time, so you per minute. So if you did 5K in 50 minutes, there's 100 meters per minute in that session. Then you can also look at it from an absolute perspective. So if we had the 5 kilometers, that is your absolute. But then if we make it relative, so in relation to a game output, and say the individual does 10K in a game and he's done 5K in training, he's then done 50% of that, that output. Again, you can utilize this for max speed. So if a player who's got 10 meters per second max speed then does 5 meters per second, he's then also done 50% of his game. We could then also look at the ratios and the interaction between two variables, and then that's an example of the dynamic stress load per distance. You can utilize information like that. And how and what we look at will determine what our overall view is of the data that we're looking. So just to provide examples, so this is using the same data set, and this is the volume from training. So the blue bar that you can see, that will fill depending on how much of a game's worth it is. So for instance, this individual, the distance, could do 10K distance, and if it was 10K on this image, that blue bar will be filled. Now looking at this, we can see that the outputs when compared to the game are relatively high, and he's done 75% of distance. He's almost done a full game's worth of zone 6. So just looking at this information, you go, okay, that's a relatively decent volume session. But then when I highlight that this individual trains for 132 minutes, we then look at the intensity. Now, the intensity of this would suggest that the individual has been less than half a game intensity for the work he's done. And this changes your perspective slightly, and you go, okay, because the intensity is less than half a game, is this what is required on this day? So there you have two different thought processes, and this is just highlighting the difference between the volume and intensity and why we need to look at it. Then we have the example of using RPE in sessions, and these are 2 sessions with a squad average for RPE and the squad average on the 2 sessions. For session 1, we've done higher outputs on the metrics highlighted, and session 2, lower metrics. However, the RPE for session 2 is higher than session 1. Now we need to determine why could session 2 be more difficult for the individuals. And this is where I highlight, it's probably to do with the intensity of the session. So if you look at session 1, the duration was 82 minutes, and we see a big reduction in the per minutes when compared to session 2. And some of session 2's outputs are almost double what session 1 was. Now I'm sure that we've all done sessions before which have lasted 30 to 40 minutes, and we see players give high RPE values. And I would suggest that it's probably likely that the intensity of the individual is key in this situation. So, like I just said, the previous experience is that the higher the intensity, the higher the RPE is provided by the players. Now, some people would suggest RPE is not worth taking because players are misunderstanding or not providing valid and reliable information. But I personally believe that it's all to do with the relationship you create with the individual. So some practitioners and I can create action. So if a manager says we're planning on doing a 2-week a session we did 2 weeks ago, what was the difficulty that players found in this session? Because we backdated the information, we can go back and say, look, they found this session relatively difficult or fairly easy, so maybe add or adjust certain areas. Then we have the volumes for high-speed running, and a lot of practitioners will try and make sure on a day where there's an extensive focus to try and hit those high-speed running sprint volume. The reason why I put this up is that a fullback can sometimes do 1,500 meters of high-speed running in a game. So would we necessarily target that in training? I probably wouldn't. I would probably focus on the time of the session you do the running in, or is it better that we just ramp up the intensity, which is what I would probably focus on. Then as practitioners, I feel it's important that we look at the game scenarios and those potential worst case moments in games. This was a game from earlier this season, and we could see that 3 or 4 players will almost sprint from box to box, going over that 7 meters per second. Now, this may only happen 2 or 3 times a season. However, I feel it's important that once we've done this in training, we are sure that they can cope with the demands when it does happen in a game. One of the things we looked at over an 8-game period was looking at the worst case scenario of high speed running. And this considers the player doing the high speed running, how long that high speed run will last. So as soon as you go over that 5.5 meters per second threshold, how long is the distance they continue running for? They're ordered by the longest distance recorded, with the line around the 10-meter mark also then highlighting the average of each individual. And we can see the individuals along the graph differ a fair bit, and positionally there can be patterns. So you can see on the left-hand side, our strikers and wide midfielders are on the higher end, our centre-backs are on the far right end. However, within the positions themselves, there can be individual differences. So I'd like to just take into account these 2 centre midfielders. The worst case scenario is fairly similar, but the number of efforts that they do are very different. So if you look on the centre midfielder on the left, his high speed running numbers are way high. So he goes into high speed running far more often than the centre midfielder on the right. And this is seen on their average of the high speed running, with the centre midfielder being on the left being one of the highest average high speed running values, compared to the one on the right being far lower. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this is that they're both centre midfielders, but it's probably the way they play the game that is affecting these outputs. So the guy on the left, I would probably suggest, is a box-to-box midfielder, so cover more ground at high speed intensities. And the guy on the right is probably more of a holding midfielder. And this needs to be taken into consideration, especially when we're looking at rehabilitation. And that's where I would say focus more on the individual rather than the positional aspects of that person. Then, whilst looking at intensity, we need to look at those intense periods of the game. So using your max intensity times in games where the intensity of the individuals are at the highest. How the body responds to whether we do this at the start, between drills or end of session will differ considerably. And we need to determine how we're going to maximize the requirements we want. So for instance, the energy demand requirements, or whether we want to do it under a state of fatigue, will determine where you place the drill, whether it be a ball drill or a running drill within your session. By placing the drill towards the end of the session, you're working the individual within fatigue. By working the individual under fatigue will require the body to work differently. So for instance, movement mechanics may change, and thus this tests the player's ability to work at a higher demand later on in the game. This is an especially important part of our rehab process, which will be explained later on by Sam. We also see, as practitioners, a high focus on the extensive nature of our work, and this rightly so, but also it has to be important that we don't neglect the need to stress the intensive metrics supramaximally as well. So I would also suggest doing a mixture of a hybrid of an extensive and intensive drill, and then looking at them both individually as well. Additionally, we try and build these within the vision of the management. So whether it is a coach who is ball focused and everything we do conditioning should be done with the ball, one that wants pure running and nothing to do with the ball, and then one that wants a mixture. By doing this, we ensure that the work across the department, by integrating as much as possible as we can, and then also maintaining that the philosophy of every department is shared. Now, I'm going to touch briefly on the difference between absolute and relative data and how we can interpret that. So what we can see here is that Player A has done more of the 3 metrics highlighted than player B. Now, does this necessarily mean that player A has worked harder than player B? So if we were to give this data set, most people probably would say player A has worked harder. However, if we look at it in relation to a game, we can see that player B has actually probably produced more than a game's worth of his extensive metrics. So if we use the example here, player A may be a fullback and player B may be a centre-back. Player A, the fullback, may actually run 1,500 metres high-speed running in a game, whereas player B is used to doing 500 metres high-speed running into a game. Their roles will determine what their condition is. So what are they conditioned to do? So for that reason, I would suggest that player B has worked harder because he's overdoing what he's used to doing, but player A has had a higher output. And that's where we have to understand the stress between different positions is completely different. And also how we look at the information will determine how we interpret the information. When planning drills, we also need to take into consideration the training model that we use. So at Arsenal, we use the terms extensive and intensive, which I'm sure the majority of teams will use. And the majority of this, whether it's extensive or intensive, is determined by the pitch size and the number of players within that drill. So firstly, the extensive nature of drills. The big point of this is that we need to provide the space for the individuals to work in. So for example, if you're trying to do a max speed, I'd advise a distance around 30 meters as a start point for the individual to open up. On our extensive days, we'll be looking at metrics such as high speed running and sprint distance, max speed, as well as speed intensity. All the information we look at is also interpreted using the absolute, relative, volume and intensity categories that we talked about earlier in this. In our previous experience, when managers use extensive ball drills, we tend to see 2 common ones. The first one is to make a play and then you see a point that they have to return to. So once the play has finished, they then transition back across a running line, and you know that roughly from this, if there's a 40-meter run, I can predict fairly carefully the high-speed running each individual will do. The other option they do, it tends to be transitional games, so attacking waves. And what we can see here in this game situation is that once we lose possession, you see 3 or 4 players then transition back. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the intensive metrics. So on this day, you tend to see tighter areas, a higher focus on pressing, and by having these tighter areas, you tend to elicit more axons B cells. Here we're focusing on accelerations and decelerations as well as explosive distance within these drills, and these drills often are small-sided games and possessions. In the bottom right, I've also included a pitch density score and high-speed running values within possession games. So pitch density is worked out from taking the length of the pitch and the width of the pitch, multiply them together, and then divide them by the number of players. So this is just used to highlight that there tends to be a tipping point from when high-speed running is facilitated by increasing the pitch size. This is definitely something I would recommend people doing. So we utilize information like this to suggest to coaches whether we want to work on a tight area pitch or a bigger area pitch, depending on the number of individuals that we have training that day. From a metric point of view, I would suggest once delivering information to coaches, keep it fairly simple. So the 4 that I tend to look at are total distance, high-speed running, sprint, and explosive distance. Practitioners do use HMLD. The only issue I have with this is it's a really good metric as an overview. If you were targeting 500 meters of HMLD one day and 700 meters of HMLD the other day, you may elicit all that HMLD through explosive distance or through high-speed running, therefore neglecting one of the other options. To delve further into the data, I would also then include some kind of loading measure, so dynamic stress load, accelerations, decelerations to look at the density of the explosive distance you're doing. Then also max speed hits over the last days. When was the last time you hit 90%? And that's referencing the Shane Malone paper. And then also we need to look at internal measures, so cardiovascular response and RPEs. From all this information, then you can put it into some form of measurement. So whether you use the Owen et al. Version of multiple mechanical modeling, or whether you utilize, so two papers looking to reference on this are Alessio Rossi in 2017, I believe, and also Javier Fernandez's one in 2016. So how you categorize different metrics and pull them together. Now, the important bit of all this information is that we have to find a way of bringing it all together. So from now on, we're going to talk about it in a rehabilitation setting purely because we have a bigger output on this, and how a multidisciplinary team of physios, doctor, performance staff come together. And then within the vision of the management, how do we produce the tactical, physical and technical requirements for that individual? Now, this is the important part where we must blend the science, which is the data, with the art of coaching. Once an individual has become injured and the player walks off with an injury, so that is when our rehabilitation process begins. 30 minutes after the game, Chris Morgan, who's our head physio, and our doctor, Gary Driscoll, will probably provide an overview of the injury and what we can expect in the immediate term. And with every injury, there are many considerations to take. And so this is where all our team members will come together to discuss actions we must take in the immediate term and also later down the line. We then also have Shad, who will then link in with the manager, who then highlights the requirements for the returning player. So this is key to our process because this determines how risky we go with the rehab. So for example, if it's a cup final next week and it's a 2-week injury, we're probably going to take a big risk in trying to get him ready for that game. If we don't have a game until after an international break and it's a 2-week injury, you've probably got the time to be a bit more conservative with the injury and then bring that player back to full fitness. This is all collated by our rehab coordinator, Tim Parham, who will lead with the process that we're going to take, and everyone has an input in the decisions we make. As you can see on the left-hand side, there are many, many, many considerations that will determine our approach, and I've also included a figure from the Control to Chaos Continuum, which was led by Matt Taberner. And this highlights some of our thought processes that we have with requirements for GPS metrics and on-field movements. And then also we took the input from Dan Cohen, who also provided some of the strength and power diagnostics that we would suggest dependent on the injury that you have. I'll now leave Sam to talk through the next part of the process and talk about how we utilize the information we gather and mix it with the coaching. So therefore, we're going to try and blend the science and the art, in particular, talking about the rehabilitation process that we do.
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me there?
Yeah, we've got you.
Okay, so just to make this process quite smooth, following up from what you said there, I think the collaboration is vital and it's essential for us to have that approach so we can draw upon the expertise and the experience of all the members of staff across departments. And we all work together with a common goal. We want to return the player back to training, competition, and optimal performance in a safe manner and do so as quickly as possible. And as you said, that process begins immediately after the injury occurs. And that requires an accurate diagnosis before an accurate prognosis. And that may require a scan. And once we do that, we get an image back. And assessments are done by physios before we sit together And in that situation, all the departments will come together and we'll create a plan with return to run, return to train, return to competition timescales. And we hope to do that within around 72 hours. We're then able to schedule options around that and work back from those targets. The injury, depending on its length, may provide an opportunity to work on other aspects of the player. So with a significant time out, they may have a lot more time to do some performance analysis than normal. And that may be something that we take up, or it might be a chance to work on certain areas of athleticism. But we aim to progressively return the player to aspects of team training as soon as we can. And this requires a stringent focus on ensuring that we progressively move the players through various targets, both on and off the pitch. The focus of this presentation is primarily around the on-pitch rehab process. However, I must emphasize the other parts of the rehab process, which are integral and highly connected to the success of the work we do on pitch. So, as I'm going to just look now at planning some of those sessions. So, as I've already alluded to it being multidisciplinary, and by the time they reach the pitch, they've already done some great work with the physios in the gym. I think carefully planning the content of these sessions that we deliver is vital to ensure logical and sequential progression, which is going to increase the likelihood of a successful rehab. Great attention to detail increases the likelihood of hitting the sweet spot in terms of session targets and aims. So on the diagram here, you can see a projected session based on some of the aims that we'd set out together as a team. If we don't hit that sweet spot, we're likely to either underdo it or overdo it. And we'll only realize retrospectively if we don't sort of plan meticulously beforehand and know what we're going to achieve with our plan. As I said, we lay out those session targets together and we work towards them. And some great work has been done behind the scenes by our data scientist, Mikhail, and he's helped, along with others, to design and build an app for us to use and to do this. And you can see some of the examples in that slide I showed there, which brings some of that life and objectivity to the session. The predictability of these outcomes not only ensures we achieve desired targets, but vitally it mitigates the risk of re-injury. This shows some of the examples of physical, technical and tactical considerations that we look at when we're planning these sessions. And it's important to consider more than just the numbers. We feel it's vital to try and hit session targets in scenarios which mimic or as close to match play as possible, particularly as we progress through that controlled chaos continuum and the player becomes closer to a return to training. So for example, an attacking player may work more towards finishing actions and combination patterns that lead into a finish, whereas a defender may work on recovering to the centre of the goal to clear across the opposition counter. The constraints placed in these drills can help us achieve physical targets whilst providing greater context through tactical and technical elements. And there's also a science and art into how we monitor that response. And Tom, you spoke about that earlier, about RPEs, and I think they're key, and especially in this scenario where you work very closely with the player in a low work player to coach ratio. We also collect daily wellness and assess stress scores. But the art behind it is vital and shouldn't be underestimated. And it's important that as much as you are using some of this data, we're using our coaching eye to constantly assess their movement and maintain regular feedback as well. It gives us a chance to check in with players, their level of confidence and comfort during the session. But it's not just about pre and post session check-ins. Even if you see a player is happy and they're comfortable with a session, I think it's a really good chance to reinforce some confidence in that movement and just show that level of care as well. The players' assessments at the start of each day are also vital feedback to us, not just between the player and the physio. It gives us an indication of how that player has responded to the work from the day before. Are they coming in too sore, or are they as you expected them? So as I talked about that progression there, this involves the manipulation of task and environmental constraints to influence that movement variability. And as Tom alluded to already, Matt Taven has done some great work along with Tom and Dan using that control chaos continuum. Now it progresses from high control to moderate control, control to chaos, moderate chaos, and high chaos. These technical actions are also progressively increased in skill and physical demand throughout this phase, and we ensure players have to respond to increasingly complex and unpredictable situations, which include the movement of other players, opponents, and interactions with the ball. I'm just going to walk you through some of these stages now. So initially, when the player returns to the pitch, we are trying to ensure they are able to build confidence in an environment where we have a high amount of control. We can use a speed interval calculator like you can see there, and that allows us to set a specific time to perform to cover a distance at a set percentage of their max speed. And during this phase, the ceiling of that tends to be around 60%. Within a squad, there can be large variations in the speed, so it's essential to consider that relative load, not just the absolute. For example, you could have a player with a max speed of 10.5 meters per second, and he's likely to get considerable amounts of high speed running while running at that sort of speed, whereas another player may get 0. And we do look to involve the ball, as you can see, in as early a phase as possible. And the players love that. It's what they want to do, but we must ensure it's in a safe and effective manner. So giving the player plenty of touches in a small amount of space, that's self-paced and is in as controlled environment as we can, is the most effective way that we find to do that. We reduce the movement variability in that area and the possible exposure to high-risk scenarios like overstretching for a pass, and something we'll progress to in a short while. So looking at the next stage, we're looking to bridge the gap from control to chaos. And players are likely to be working much more with the ball now. And we're trying to get other players around them, or coaches, or we use as we can. This provides an opportunity for technical refinement where they may not have been playing passes with other players. That's why it's best if we can use them, and we've used academy players previously. And it's also a great opportunity for a coach to step in and give technical refinement there and give detail around which way they receive the ball, which side, and where they're passing to in their movement off and away from a mannequin, an example provided. So we can see here this drill come to life, an example of progression through that, through some reduction in those constraints. And the constraints are still very important during this phase, because you don't want to allow the physical demand, or for example, a mishit pass to a super keen player who's been out for a while, to cause him to overstretch or overstride. And remember, we're still trying to mitigate that risk of re-injury. The good thing about this drill also is they provide a great way to get some conditioning work into the players. They're much keener to run when the ball's involved and they're moving in response to others than they are up and down. Towards the end stage, and we can see a drill here, we're targeting match-like intensity, whereby we can use per minute data in relation to the game. Position-specific actions are things we try to use, and we consider those technical and tactical elements while we're simultaneously trying to develop fitness. What you can see here in the third drill of a given session is the player working above match intensity for high-speed running and explosive distance value in a per minute comparison to a game. And that's something that we really tried to develop and push through in our rehab, and Tom spoke about some of those things earlier. Another section of this part of this phase is that players may be able to perform parts of team training. And like I alluded to earlier, this is really important, and it's something that we try to do. And we're very fortunate that our manager and our coaches are very receptive to this and are always keen to work with these players and modify where we can. So just looking at how we sort of take that process the next bit further. We use a plan, do and review cycle. And that's something that we do together. And it's a constant process involving a number of key stakeholders. And it's not just something that's happening on the pitch. It's, like I said earlier, it's a relation to things that are happening on the gym or inside and between departments. And I spoke about the importance of meticulous planning and attention to detail, bringing those plans to life and progressing through stages. But the key to the process is also reviewing what we've done so we can make sure that we refine it and improve it for the future. Fortunately for us, there's typically more than one member of staff involved in a rehab session that we're doing on the pitch, which means you can share your thoughts, opinions, and reflect together. We also have a great camera setup and a really helpful analysis team, so we can record and review our sessions. Our sessions are planned out with drill details well in advance, but by regularly reviewing after each sessions, you can refine that process and optimize it as you move forward. There's a certain science to this, but there's also an art to this process too. And I would say the data maybe perhaps allows you to ask better questions, especially when we're giving feedback. So it's important to consider the data at a deeper level. I mentioned earlier about looking at relative, not just absolute loads and intensity of actions in comparison to a game. Now, when I said about multiple members of staff being with a player in a rehab scenario, Tom, for example, may be on a different pitch with the team, and he may ask about how an intensively biased rehab session went with a player. And the player looked and he felt great. And as we're coming off the pitch, we're using the STATSports live system, and we look like we've hit close to the targets we set. However, it's, like I said, it's important to delve into that data further, ensure that the number of those D cells, for example, they're at a range of intensities which we progress throughout the rehab. As you can see here, you could have a D cell at 3 meters per second or 5, and they both just register as a single D cell. Alternatively, it may be that the D cell count was very low, and then when you look back, you actually, well, the magnitude of those was quite high. So if you look at this 3-day period here, highlighted with a black box around on the left-hand side, you can see that the D cell values are green for all 3 consecutive days, which would imply that they're less than 50% of a match load. But when we delve further into this data, the intensity of these D cells varies and is actually reflected in the dynamic stress load you can see on the right-hand side. By asking these questions and working together, it allows us to better review that process and make sure that we're moving forward in the right direction. So that's very much sciencey, and we've spoke about the science and the art, and how we achieve those different D cells, for example, is definitely an art. And we progress those through this continuum that we spoke about. And initially, we're going to be in a state of a higher control. And when we introduce in change of direction or D cells and ACT cells, they're very much pre-planned. And by reducing constraints as we progress, we're going to get, as we get closer to match-like scenarios, whereby players are reacting and responding at speeds in relation to the ball and other players, we're going to move them along that process and smooth that transition. It's important that we look at the progression of technical actions as well, which isn't measured by any data. For example, the distance or the angle, speed, foot surface, and striking pattern are all progressive considerations of passing. It's not just important to consider those, it's also worth considering actions like crossing, shooting, jumping and landing, and how we ask the athlete to perform those. Are they doing it in a fresh state, in a fatigue state? And what about the volume that we're doing them at? This means that we have towards a checklist, and we can break out the science and the art. And we spoke about a lot there on the left-hand side with hitting certain metrics, but sometimes it could be forgotten that we need to emphasize the importance of the amount of passing volumes and the types of passing and the range of passing. And I saw in the Aspetar journal that Matt Taberner and Tom were a part of. There were some great progressions there at different phases of control care's continuum about using some of them technical actions. As I've highlighted a number of times, it's imperative that the collaboration between staff remains throughout the rehab process. It's certainly a player-centered approach. We aim to optimize that utilizing the broad collective skill sets and the vast amounts of experience with the people we're fortunate enough to work with.
Yeah, and just to add to what Sammy's talked about is I doubt a player knows how many different individuals are part of this process. So whether that be the analysts pulling up videos for the individual, the data that comes from the data science team, the head of performance going to the manager to find out information that's required, the nutritionist planning his immediate nutrition load, the psychologist checking in with him, 3 or 4 different physios going to the individual, the coach is then finding out what they can work on, doing video analysis. And what we're trying to highlight here is that, look, the data is really, really important to informing our processes, but it's also the people around that data. And it's the importance of collaborating as a team, trying to make sure that the player is getting the best welfare he can possibly get. And all this has to be done within the vision of the management we have. And that's by maintaining our shared processes throughout the football club. Just to end this presentation, just like I said there, I would suggest that you use data to inform your process. The data we look at may not be suitable for the club you work at or the sport you work in. Data should not dictate what you do, but it should definitely inform how you look at information and the steps that you're going to take. Also, you need to be able to blend the data, so the science, with the art of the coaching. And this is the key to success. The success is not whether you have the best database of information going or whether you're the best coach in the world. Because if those two don't meet up together, then at the end of the day, the success will not necessarily happen. And it just always goes back to the people working within it and making sure there's a collaborative way of working together. Thanks for listening to everyone. And if you want to find out any more information, you can contact myself or Sam through Twitter. And there's loads of stuff on the Arsenal SEMS website that's coming out at the minute about how we work. And yeah, if you want any studies or any suggestions, please feel free to jump in and give us a question. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, cheers for that, guys. Lot of information there, a lot of detail. Thank you very much for that. Just like I really like the last quote is the blending the science of the data with the art of coaching, and it sort of links us in nicely to the first question that I got that we have here. And I'll let you guys decide which one of you wants to answer the questions, or both of you. As a performance department, do you adapt your philosophy to match that of the manager's football philosophy, or could you maybe give us a bit more detail on that?
Yeah, so I've worked with many different managers, and you tend to find that the overriding philosophy is fairly similar between different managers. So they want as many players to be fit on a game day. They want as little injuries as possible. And you cannot have a player being too fit. So everything is regarded on making sure they can have the selection and the player is able to do what they want to do. The difference between managers, in my experience, is how they go about that. So like I mentioned earlier, you might have a manager who's very focused on doing a lot of stuff with the ball, and then you might have a manager who's like, the fitness coaches don't touch the ball, the fitness coaches only do running. And then you also have the guys who do a bit of a blend. And that's where we adapt our philosophy to the manager that we have at the time. And so therefore, basically the overriding philosophy stays the same of making sure players are fit and healthy to do what is required for them. The requirements in game may change slightly. So whether your manager is more possession based or whether he's more counter-attacking or pressing based, and then it's just filling in with what the coach's focus is. Sammy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Okay, I think Sam's just on mute there, Tom, sorry. But okay, I'll just move on there. The second question here is sort of in an in-season week, how much of match high-speed running and sprint distance would you intend to have the players covering in a sort of a standard training week?
So it will vary depending on where you are in the season. So, for example, we will be preparing them early October to November time to cope with three games worth of high-speed running and sprint, just because we know the Christmas period they're going to be required to do that in the space of 4 or 5 days.
Okay.
So it will vary. So it will vary between 1 game's worth and then it'll jump up to 3 games worth. From a rehab perspective, we tend to try and get them between 2 to 3 games worth by the time they come back to training. And obviously that's dependent on how long the injury is.
Okay. And then the last question is just, do you have targets for the the players to hit individually during the sort of lockdown at the moment? I don't know, or what's your sort of approach there?
Yeah, so the way we've done it is, so we sent out the Apex athlete units to all the lads, and to increase competition, what we have done is we've teamed up all the players, and then we've also got a team of staff. So everyone is going to do the running program that's going to be set, and just to add a little bit of competition, we're going to provide feedback of where they sit within their teams, how their teams sit against the staff team, just so we can all have a bit of a laugh and make sure we still keep that camaraderie within the team. And that's also included with S&C programs that Barry Sullivan sent out as well. And then different individuals have different members of players that they need to keep on top of, just to make sure the well-being is all good.
Okay. Well, great. That's thanks a million, Tom, for coming on, and Sam, you too, for taking the time to put that together. And thanks for sharing it with us. And best of luck to you guys, of course, obviously, when things get back to normal.
Thanks,
Cheers,
Pat.
guys. Thank you for having us.
Take care.
Okay.
Stay safe.